The real value of culture becomes evident in the face of crisis. Culture in the time of Corona. Virtual European Capital of Culture Forum on May 20 to 22.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a very interesting and difficult moment to analyze what is the future of culture in this European scenario. And I am particularly happy that this happens in the context of the process for the construction of Kaunas 2022. So the European Capital of Culture, which is probably one of the contexts in which this kind of reasoning not only makes more sense, but also can have the bigger impact potentially. So the future of culture is clearly a question that in the post-COVID scenario connects to the more general scenario of the future of just everything. So the really interesting thing is that we are witnessing a sort of rebooting of all aspects of our economy, of our society. So it's very important to consider the changes in culture also from this point of view, not simply as a sectoral problem, but as something that is embedded in a much more complex scenario. Why this is important? Of course, there are many reasons, but one is that this provides us with an exceptional opportunity to rethink, first of all, the role of culture in the wider society and in wider economy. Why this is needed? Well, because one of the problems with culture, and this is also true before the crisis, is exactly the fact that for most people, there is a very poor understanding of what is the potential of culture in the generation of social and also in part economic value. There is, as we know, a mechanical tendency to identify culture with entertainment, or in some cases to identify culture with something that has to do with cultural tourism, or in other senses also to identify culture with, for example, high society and privilege, because for many people still culture is something that sounds like a club, a party I am not invited in. And all these issues, of course, are important because not only this compromises the capacity of culture to have political relevance and representation, but also prejudicates the possibility for people to participate actively, even in contexts in which they would actually enjoy it very much if they knew what was the real meaning of that particular opportunity. So what is happening now is that we are in the middle of what we could call a natural experiment. It's something that, in ordinary reality would have never happened, but that has created such exceptional conditions in which we can really appreciate what can be the impact of certain activities in totally what would have been otherwise purely theoretical conditions. And this is in particular, what has been the relationship between culture and the mental, the psychological well-being of people during the lockdown. So it's clear that without the availability of content, all kinds of creative content, from movies to TV series to books to music to video games to whatever, our mental health that has been already shaken dramatically, the early data that we have is that clearly this has been very aggravated for many people, not only for people who already had issues of mental health. This seclusion has been a very, very hard challenge in this regard, and of course it's not over yet. But the availability of culture and creative content has clearly been enormously important in helping people preserve their mental cohesiveness, their psychological well-being. So we understand that there is a role for culture that is much more fundamental than simply entertaining people, but has to do really with welfare, with well-being. And this is one first perspective that is extremely important to explore. As you probably know, there is already a wealth of research and policy experimentation in the relationship between health and well-being and culture. And recently, the World Health Organization has even issued a report, a scoping report, where there is a systematic review of the now countless possible applications of cultural experiences and participation in the field, not simply of psychological well-being, but also of medical and clinical intervention. So this is an area we should consider with particular importance for the future. And again, this should not be made only from the point of view of the cultural sector. It's extremely important to make governments aware of what is the potential of cultural participation and more generally cultural policy to contribute a new, extremely innovative cultural welfare perspective for the future of our societies and economies. And this, of course, also implies very important consequences for the development of new professional profiles, new professional figures that today are not yet available and that could receive very, very strong attention also from the professional markets in the close future. But the other issue that has become so apparent in this transition has been, of course, the importance, the escalation of the digital. In a situation like this, of course, the digital has been indispensable to secure access, also in situations in which physical access was impossible. And look at what, for example, museums have been doing or theaters have been doing in terms of making available content on digital platform to maintain the connection with their audiences and to build new audiences for this material that in normal conditions probably would have been very difficult to reach. So this has been a sort of emergency response, something that has been done on the prompt of the difficulty of maintaining a relationship in normal conditions. But it's clear and apparent now that this digital revolution is not simply a temporary situation, a temporary solution that we have found for an emergency, but it's something that is going to have long-lasting consequences in terms of its change, of its transformational power for how we access cultural content in the future. One could say, okay, this has been mainly, in practical terms, a huge business opportunity, for example, for commercial digital platforms that have been able to sell their services, of course, Netflix, Spotify, name it, to a wider public now that is, of course, that has more time available and it's eager to access more content. And this is certainly true. Clearly, this digital revolution implies a further boost for the already existing for-profit commercial platforms. But the point is that we are also in a phase in which, even before the crisis, the expansion of for-profit commercial platforms was seen with increasing, let's say, critical stances from so many different sectors of the public opinion, not because there is anything bad in it, but because we cannot imagine a digital ecosystem that is entirely driven by private for-profit commercial platforms. It's extremely important to consider that in a moment like this, in which we have to rethink the role of culture in the global functioning of our societies and economies, it's very important to have also public initiative platforms that are able to bring in this digital ecosystem exactly the museums, the theaters, the small, for example, organizations that are extremely vital and extremely vibrant today in promoting the most innovative drives of culture and creative production, as it always has been. Because, of course, I mean, where cultural innovation happens is especially where there is not an immediate market pressure. So all the research in contemporary arts, all the research in performing arts, all the research that has to do with the heritage archives and museums is not simply research. It's an incredible cradle of content that, if properly deployed, can not only, again, reach new audiences, but can also lead the experimentation of new formats, new transformational uses of cutting-edge technologies. Think, for example, what is happening today in augmented reality and virtual reality and artificial intelligence, to make an example. And it's extremely important that there is a state as a public investment, I think not only at the national level or regional level, I think also at the European Union level, that really builds a new kind of public infrastructure that also brings the platform digital economy digital content economy itself to a new level, where we really start thinking of renegotiating the space for cultural participation as not entirely driven by the tech giants, but more and more also by a new vision that has to do with the public interest and can also help regulate the kind of far west that the digital platform economy has been so far. Because we were at the beginning of the story, because, for example, people were not aware of the consequences, for example, of subscribing for free to social media, but giving away all the data and all the metadata, especially of our own experience, habits, and so on and so forth. So I think that there is an exciting new scenario from this point of view, which is a scenario of opportunity, innovation, and experimentation, where it is extremely important that culture understands how its role can change. And to be more specific, everything has to do with the fact that ultimately culture has an extremely powerful capacity of making people shift their perception and change their behaviors. We have been so far practically unaware of the fact that culture is an incredible lever of behavioral change. The fact that we access culture seamlessly throughout the day, that we access musical content, for example, theatrical content, visual content, has not only effects in terms of our psychological mood, but is also influencing deeply our own biological functioning, our own cognitive response, our emotional functionality. So it's extremely important that the cultural sector understands that we need a much more holistic view of what culture does in this new scenario, and the pervasiveness of the digital platforms can really make of this a completely new way to organize our own perception of who we are, what we do during the day in the various aspects of our daily life. This, of course, is not to claim that physical institutions are worthless. Of course, they're not. And fortunately, we hope that as soon as possible, of course, it will be possible again to access our physical institutions. The point is that it's not a sort of return to order. We have to think that also the physical space now has to be considered as a hybrid space, where this connection, this seamless connection with the digital dimension really becomes a toggling in and out of different dimensions which are complementary. This clearly requires a major shift, a major change of attitude, because the cultural field, for example, in certain sectors especially, has been a bit skeptical, a bit defensive towards the digital revolution. This is something that, of course, it's in some sense a trace of the past, not because the past is bad and the future is good. Of course, the future can be also very challenging and very threatening. But it's clear that what's happening opens up a new incredible opportunity for social impact and transformational impact of culture that should not be absolutely given up. To conclude this perspective, I also want to stress that, of course, I have emphasized the dimension of health and well-being, but there are clearly other aspects in which the social impact of culture can be extremely important. And think, for example, of social cohesion. This crisis, of course, is also stressing profoundly our society from so many points of view that we can imagine, of course, that anti-social disgregating forces will also come into play in the very complex post-COVID transition. So it's extremely important to understand that culture, again, can provide us with exceptional possibilities, exceptional resources, for example, in creating a more effective intersubjective communication, especially in context of cultural diversity, because culture in the end gives us a priceless opportunity to develop empathic capacities to read the mind and sentiments of other people, also through the social simulations that are possible, for example, through stories. Again, this is a very important but much overlooked so far possibility. The fact that, for example, for tackling major societal crises, stories and culture can become an integral part of a coherent policy approach is extremely important. And other aspects, of course, like developing, for example, an environmental awareness or improving the capacity at the regional or community level of, for example, being more oriented towards new ideas, new innovations is, for example, another area where culture can play a major role. The good news is that all these lines of work are already resumed in the new European Agenda for Culture. So Europe already has a guiding document for future policy choices in the cultural field and not only, that are already structuring the reflection and the action in this direction. So it's extremely important that European regions, cities, and countries, of course, the member states, become aware of this possibility and possibly create networks of cooperation throughout Europe to implement, to study and implement new models and solutions. From this point of view, of course, European capitals of culture provide natural laboratories. And I think that also for the thematic focus that the Kaunas 2022 has established, I think this could really be a major laboratory for experimentation and policy development for this. Okay, I think I should stop here because my time is up. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Pier Luigi. Your talk is really appreciated and highlights very topical areas. I would like to continue with you with a few questions. And I'd like to start from a few of your last statements that touch the digitization of culture, which has been a very important trend in these last few months. As soon as culture started moving rapidly online, we've bumped into questions. You mentioned the problem of monetization of artistic content online, about this competition with the tech giants online, but also it touches, such areas or priorities of culture as accessibility, engagement of harder to reach groups. And there is a concern that the digital means provide additional challenges in reaching socially vulnerable groups or harder to reach groups of society. In fact, in the last forum, one of your quotes that I still remember is that you are poetically accomplished if you have an impact. This was a quote, commenting the aesthetic canons, the new aesthetic canons. So do you think that the digital culture allows to make a strong impact or social impact, or does it pose a new challenge for that?
Of course, there are big challenges, and we should not make the mistake to think that the digital ecosystems as we know them today are the standard we have to have in mind when considering these opportunities. Of course, we are not prepared yet. What we have today is absolutely not up to standard to really have culture make the difference from this point of view. The first issue, as you correctly pointed out, is connectivity. In particular, the fact that today, especially for the most marginalized and vulnerable parts of our community, the possibility to connect to the digital sphere in terms that allow a real participation is very, very limited, and in some cases even non-existent. So in a sense, this kind of transition implies that connectivity, digital connectivity, becomes something of a basic human right. If there is no specific habilitation from this point of view, everything that we say is simply meaningless. So this is a first point that should be considered very carefully. And recently, there has been, by the way, an interesting intervention in the Science Policy Forum, so one of the most important scientific journals, where 4 members of the Pontifical Committee for Science, so the Vatican, in this case, a group of scientists, made a case exactly for this, the necessity to consider digital connectivity as a basic human right. And it's interesting that it comes, for example, from a voice like that. The second point is that, of course, this also implies a complete change of mentality, not simply in terms of the kind of content that we deliver, but also, of course, as you again pointed out, for example, the business models. One of the aspects that has been focal so far, for example, in a platform economy, basically driven by private interests, was, of course, squeezing as much as possible from creative content from the platform manager point of view. So, of course, almost starving the artist. We know that, for example, streaming, from this point of view, is a big business for the platform, but not necessarily for the artist. For the artist, this is really creating some criticality. Unless you are a superstar, I mean, making a living from what you get from streaming your content through commercial platforms is sometimes very difficult. So what can we do from this point of view? This is why we need also public platforms that have a different perspective, where, of course, the interest is not squeezing as much value added as possible, but enabling certain type of content that, of course, cannot be only free content, can also be paid content, but paid content with criteria that enable the sustainability of the operators that are there. What I expect is that if this kind of content, of course, becomes interesting, and of course, it's not a matter of making a competition against the private providers, because, of course, the kind of content that is delivered is different. For example, in the commercial platforms today, you find basically the greatest, latest hits, so to speak. For example, Netflix is only interested at the moment, for example, in streaming, in some sense, recent production. But for, of course, the huge archives, for example, of television and cinema, are completely not covered from this point of view. And in many cases, these archives are also in the public domain. So it's extremely interesting to consider these other aspects, and it's also interesting to consider, for example, theater companies or, for example, museums, where of course, the logic is different than the logic of commercial streaming of creative content, where public platform can make the difference. What I expect is that if a new criterion breaks in from this point of view, this will also inevitably condition the terms with which the commercial platforms can get content or can exploit content on their own right. So probably this will also bring about a redefinition of the business models, not only for the private sector, but also for the public sector. So the point is, we have to be open-minded and experimental, because this is a new field. It's basically unbroken ground, and we need to learn.
Thank you. Still, the physical institutions, as you say, their importance doesn't disappear, but there is a lot of concern about the behavioral changes in the audience. So what will happen? What should we expect from the audience, from the participants of culture after the quarantine ends, after the restrictions are lifted? What are your ideas about that? You mentioned about the hybrid spaces in the physical institutions, but how does this situation change the cultural models, the models of cultural content in the future? For example, the European Capital of Culture programs that are also associated with big, massive events.
Well, it's clear that in the very short term, there is relatively little we can do. But at the same time, clearly, this full immersion into the digital space is already profoundly changing the expectations and the perception, the mental categories, the experience, what people define as an experience. This means that from the cultural sector point of view, what is important now is really a massive investment in innovating also the way in which physical space relate to visitors and I should say participants, because it's less and less in terms of passive visits and more in terms of really establishing a dialogue with people entering the museum space or the theater space. This means that we really need to build digital shells, digital infrastructures that integrate and complement the physical experience itself. This was already happening before the crisis. But clearly what the crisis has done is to accelerate dramatically this kind of transition that in normal conditions would have probably taken 1 decade, but now really has to be implemented, I think, in a few years' time, if we really wanted to reaffirm the potential of culture to really be significant for people, and also in some sense to inform the vision that people can have in the rebuilding of our society and our economy after the crisis. It's not simply, again, a matter of, let's say, how can we maintain our public? It's more and more a matter of how culture can redefine its role in this very complex reshuffling of the organization, of the functioning of our cities, of our economies, of our societies. So it's extremely important that, in some sense, the cultural players get out of their comfort zone. This is a contradiction that always makes me laugh a bit. So we, as cultural players, we constantly invite people to step up of their comfort zones, but the cultural players themselves are very wary of stepping out of theirs. So it's extremely important that culture itself understands that this is now a completely new ball game, and we have to learn the new rules, but also in some sense negotiate the new rules if we are visionary and propositional enough.
Thank you. Also, this topic of our discussion is about the role of culture in a crisis, in an extreme situation that today the whole world is facing. You rightly mentioned that culture has been analyzed from different perspectives. Arts and culture have been analyzed. Their impact on the well-being, on the psychological well-being of the society, also their economic impact. Despite of that, culture sector or arts sector in many countries around the world is, the sector that is most likely or more likely to suffer from public funding cuts during this situation. And you mentioned that in your talk, in your initial talk, that this situation might be an opportunity to reposition culture or strengthen its significance in the eyes of society. So what does this experiment rely on? The results of this experiment rely on, and why is there such a miscommunication about the importance of culture still, although so many years we are talking about different impacts of culture?
Yeah, I think that, again, this is really, on one side, changing the mental maps of the politicians. I think that in a moment like this, of course, last year, maybe we could say, okay, culture is generally the victim of the budget cuts, as it always happens. But now it's different. Now, in a situation like this, of course, there will be massive public spending to reboot the economy. And clearly, culture must have a big part in this. So we really have to fight and to negotiate a different attention for culture in this particular regard, also because culture is one of the most fragile sectors at the global economic point of view, because of course it's very dispersed, it's very pulviscular. Most of culture has to do with micro companies, with freelancers that are completely bankrupt if they cannot be supported in a moment like this. So one point is that now we really have to ask also for public resources anyway. But beyond this, it's extremely important to understand that there are exactly new ways to be viable. For example, when we understand what is the relationship between culture, well-being, and health, there can really be, in a moment like this especially, there can be a massive initiative, massive experimentation for new programs, in which, for example, active aging can also be taken through cultural content and strategies, and not only through the traditional medical approaches. And this, of course, can bring about a substantial, for example, saving of resources and improvement also the quality of life of people in the program, thanks to the big impact that culture has in terms of health and well-being, just to make a simple example. And more generally, culture has to negotiate its role now also as a platform of behavioral change. We have to be inventive. We have to create new types of social entrepreneurship, where culture is not simply offering content for, let's say, the enjoyment of it in the traditional circumstances, in the museum, in the theater, but it's very much now about what's the relationship with the school, with the organizational space, also the company offices, for example, or the hospitals, or the public space. So it's extremely important that we are now propositionals. We cannot expect that the politicians understand this and then explain to the cultural sector what the cultural sector can do for them. It must be the other way around. We must explain to the politicians what can we do for them now that they didn't suspect we could. So it's extremely important that now there is a big, from this point of view, push forward, from the point of view of the cultural sector, to be much more visionary, propositional, and not simply sticking to the old habits and simply defending the old positions. Of course, this is necessary, but if it is just that, it's probably a weak line of attack.
Thank you, Pier Luigi, and we are very much waiting forward for your participation also on Friday's session on the future, the post-pandemic futures of the culture sector. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good afternoon from Kaunas, the future European Capital of Culture 2022. We're starting our live broadcast, and you've just listened to a pre-recorded talk and interview with Mr. Pier Luigi Sacco, who is a professor of cultural economics at the IULM University in Milan. He's also the director of the OECD Venice office, co-director of the Computational Human Behavior Lab at Bruno Kessler Foundation in Trento, a senior researcher at the Meta Lab in Harvard, and a visiting scholar at Harvard University. We've experienced a few technical difficulties at the beginning, so we want to thank you for your patience, patience of the audience. Well, culture might be immune to Corona, but definitely not to technical issues. My name is Anna Czyżanskina. I'm head of program at Kaunas 2022, the European Capital of Culture, and I will moderate today's session. And I am together with our panel members, which I will briefly introduce now. This is François Matarasso. He's a community artist, writer, and researcher. It's Elze Christensen-Redzepovic, an EU and the European Capital of Culture expert and advisor. She's also manager of Voices of Culture project. Rytis Zemkauskas, my colleague, curator at Kaunas 2022, as well as a journalist and television producer. Algirdas Ramashka is also with us. He's the CEO of Vilnius International Film Festival Kino Pavasaris, and Pete Kercher, ambassador of the EIDD Design for All Europe network. He's also consultant in strategic design. Welcome all, and thank you for today's session. I will start also from a few sentences in Lithuanian to explain the Lithuanian audience the technicalities of the language interpretation. So, laba diena Lietuvos žiūrovams ir dalyviams. Noriu informuoti jūs apie galimybę visų forumo sesijų metu klausytis sinchroninio pokalbių vertimo į lietuvių kalbą. Vertimai klausytis tiesiog turite įsijungti specialų internetinį kanalą, kurio nuorodą rasite po transliacijos langų esančioje informacijoje. And switching back to English, we are meeting at a very challenging, a very stressful time. But behind the challenges of the current period, there are also some opportunities for innovation and strengthening the role and importance of culture in the eyes of society that was just mentioned in Pier Luigi's talk. It's in the mission of culture actors to create insightful reflections and interpretations of the events and ideas surrounding us, as well as to suggest creative, innovative responses to the situations that our society is facing. So if we deal with the situation with confidence, active approach, and intuition, we are likely to transform this difficult experience into important lessons as well. I wish that to everyone, every participant of the forum. Like every European Capital of Culture Forum, which is an annual event, this virtual edition will again focus on the impacts of culture. This time, the participants of the forum will reflect on culture in the period of a global crisis and the post-pandemic world. The participants of the forum will respond to such topics as how the sector in Europe deals with the current challenges, what instruments and programs are being launched to help the sector overcome the crisis, what are the possibilities of maintaining international cooperation in the current situation, and what changes in the culture sector should be expected in the post-pandemic world, if any. The forum will include 5 thematic sessions, so the one you are attending now and 2 more each of the next 2 days. The whole program can be found on the website of the European Capital of Culture Forum, as well as on the website of Kaunas European Capital of Culture. These sessions are being broadcasted on the website of the forum, social networks of Kaunas 2022, and the Lithuanian media portal 15minutes.lt. We encourage the audience to use all of these channels to interact with the panel members. Each of the broadcast platforms allows you to post questions in the comment sections, which we will refer to during our discussion, which will follow the initial statements of the panel members. Finally, the forum this year is co-organized by Kaunas European Capital of Culture and the Creative Europe Desk in Lithuania. Before we start, I would like to thank our partners, the Creative Europe Desk in Lithuania, as well as Kaunas City Municipality, Kaunas District Municipality, and the Lithuanian government supporting the European Capital of Culture program, which allows us to continue these international gatherings and talks for the third year in a row. Next, we will start our thematic session, and today we are holding one titled "The Role of Culture Defeating the Crisis." We will be speaking about the experiences of the culture sector during the quarantine, during this global situation, unprecedented situation. We will speak about the real significance of culture in an emergency situation, and the insights on culture which were triggered by the confrontation with the present crisis. We will start from initial statements from all of our panel members, and then we will follow with a conversation where questions will be offered by me, the moderator, as well as you, the participants, the audience of the forum. I will start by introducing our first panelist, who is my colleague, Rytis Zemkauskas. He is the initiator of various cultural and educational TV projects. He works as a journalist, writer, presenter, and producer. And since 2015, he's a team member of the project Kaunas European Capital of Culture 2022. Rytis, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is the sound okay? Okay, thank you, Anna. And you know, from my experience in television, technical difficulties could be a good thing because they help us to win some time, and time is an asset. And I hope that many people in the audience used that little bit of time to contemplate on a subject. So I will start, of course, with the main theme, which Anna had described. And I would like to start like this, very simple. Dear Pandemia, Our Lady of Corona, thank you. What you do to me, of course, hurts, and sometimes it is tasteless. But I think overall, you do a great job. Namely, you help us, the European Capital of Culture here in Kaunas, to implement some of our goals and to put our deeds next to our words. You know, 3 years ago, when we started the forum, the Capital of Culture Forum in Kaunas, I had an opportunity to make a report in which I basically spoke about broadening of our understanding of what culture is and how culture could be described. I will start my little presentation now. I hope the screen will be successfully shared with you. Okay, so you see, in this country, we were and still sometimes are terribly narrow when we think culture, when we speak culture, and when we mean culture. Culture in popular understanding was and still sometimes is limited to arts, artists, and museums. And that's it. Sometimes it's about folklore, you know, but folklore is often taken as something separate and something in between history and patriotism. And religion is definitely never culture to us, which is interesting. You see, patriotism as well. And go and try tell patriots that they are people of culture. They will beat you. Why? Because culture is a soft thing for them, and they are tough guys. We still cannot see culture as a power tool. But there are people who do. And that is why we lose our wars on propaganda sometimes, by the way. Some 20 years ago, we had culture news as part of every news block on 3 different channels, including the commercial ones here in Lithuania. And they even had separate TV hosts to present these news of culture. Not anymore. Not anymore. Ratings were bad. Why? Because it was always about soft things. Jubilee of famous artists, you know, some award ceremony, or which painting of Picasso has been sold at Sotheby's, and for how much? Sort of glamour. Not so glamorous and provocative art events, they usually used to make the conventional news block, or when they talked about Ministry of Culture, for instance, or culture financing, that wasn't included into the culture news. The national television, which I am also a proud member of, used to have an entire channel devoted and called Culture Channel, the Culture Channel. Not anymore, and again, it is a good thing to my mind, because when the channel was renamed into LRT Plus, just simple thing, ratings got better with exactly the same content. Therefore, I presume that the very word culture was a problem. Not culture itself, of course, because we had narrowed the concept. We had made it a high-flown elite thing, you know, strangely mixed with cabinet of curiosities in a way. And that was indigestible. That simply that didn't make sense. So 3 years ago, I was speaking here at the Capital of Culture Forum in Kaunas. I was speaking of culture instead as of our way to deal with challenges, and as of citizenship and civilization. And I tried to make a point that culture is a power tool capable of changing lives for good or for bad. So Pandemia, Our Lady of Corona, went further and proved that culture can literally save lives. Because my choice to voluntarily limit myself for the benefit of the others is a purely cultural move. And the difference in death toll between countries can be explained only in cultural categories. American cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead has argued in her day that the beginning of civilization was the point where we can find remains of humans who survived after a broken femur. It is the longest bone in our leg. And in animal kingdom, if you break a leg, you die. So civilization, and I argue culture, starts when somebody is ready to sacrifice own comfort and safety to help the other without seeing the immediate benefits. This happens now in every hospital. And so the third thing Corona, together with the first cultured humans around 15,000 years ago, teaches us is that culture is never immediately effective. That is why it is hard to defend cultural processes, ways, approaches, and financing. It is not immediately visible, immediately effective. Culture is a slow medicine, but it works. Quarantine works. Social distancing works, slowly. And Kaunas, the European capital of culture, is a good example. We have invested in community. We have invested in people outside traditional domain of arts. And it was very much time and money consuming thing with lots of dead ends and U-turns and whatnot. And for a long time, the effects were not visible. We had to withstand criticism, shaming, ignoring. We still have. But in time of pandemia, we got into spotlight with our courtyard festival events, concerts, related projects. And all of a sudden, we got thousands of positive reviews. And all this because of Corona. Because, you know, citizenship is culture. Neighborhood is a cultural concept, basically. Self-restriction, self-conscious behavior are purely cultural phenomena. Basically, every decision, I would argue, I make voluntarily is in its essence a cultural decision. Every voluntarily action is almost always culturally motivated, I would argue. And here's me the day before yesterday on a Lithuanian-Latvian border. There are no guards, but we don't cross. Because this is cultural. Because culture deals with domains beyond immediate profit and utilitarian good. It is constructive, could be destructive, of course, but always contextual and always about meaning. And it saves lives. So again, dear Corona, thank you for helping me in my mission to broaden the concept. I hope we will continue to work together. That was my little presentation. Thank you very much, and I very much hope to hear from the other participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rytis. This was a contribution by Rytis Zemkauskas, my colleague, curator at Kaunas 2022, as well as a journalist and television producer. Dear audience, dear viewers, you can post your question to Rytis and other panel members in the comment sections of the broadcast platform you're using to watch this session. Next, we will move to our other panel member. He's François Matarasso. His work combines community arts practice with research and writing. He has worked in many countries, from Colombia to Kyrgyzstan. His research work, including the latest book, A Restless Art, are focused on the theory, experience, and outcomes of people's participation in art, and have been widely published and translated. Now, François, I hope you hear us and you can enter now this discussion. We are waiting for your talk. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Yeah, I hear you. I presume you can hear me. It's interesting, following on two very thoughtful and clear presentations. I think I have much less certainty about what is happening to us and where we're going, and it's that uncertainty that I will share. There are some things that are clear. We have a world that is transformed in a number of ways. First of all, our geopolitical scene is changing enormously. There are unpredictable international relations emerging. For the first time in decades, we are seeing borders being reintroduced into the European space. How that will change us remains to be seen. The economic effects of what is happening are unquestionably enormous, and it will take us a great deal of time as societies to recover from the costs that of the amount of money that has had to be spent, and crucially, I think also the effects on the people. I think that the social effects, both from the lockdown, but also of coping with not being able to run your business, not being able to go to work, all of those things are going to take a huge amount of time and effort to recover. And then, of course, the cultural world is being transformed. As we've heard, there are new models of production and distribution, but I think also new values and new demands. My impression is that many of us are rethinking what we consider to be important, who we admire, why we admire them. All of that adds up, I think, to three different visions of what the future might be that I would characterize as hopes and fears. There are a lot of people who hope to go back to normal, whatever normal was. And I think to some extent it's understandable. We have, certainly in my life, we have never had such a overwhelming upheaval to normal life. And it is very understandable that people want to go back to work, go back to normal relations, go back, be able to sit in a restaurant near to other people, with friends, and so on. One of the things about the back to normal, though, is that it implies that normal was a good place, and it was a good place for some people. It wasn't a good place for other people. There are other hopes and fears that people have. One is the idea of taking back control. There has been undoubtedly a rise in authoritarian ideas and language and attitudes. We are living through a period when, certainly I'm living in France, there is considerable control by the state over what we do, and for some people that's welcome. That is, we're at a time of danger. We need to restrict freedoms, and that, I think, will be one of the pressures that come. And then there is a third pressure. I think a lot of people are asking, what might we make instead? What have we learned? There's been a revival of community engagement, of social solidarity. People are talking about the way in which we are coming to properly appreciate the climate change, because the world is changing so much because of the lockdown. And I think in the cultural sector, a lot of people are asking whether we can go to something better than we had. And I think in the period after the lockdown, we are going to have different voices arguing for all three of those different visions of the world, and how those arguments get resolved democratically will fundamentally affect the kind of world that we move into. But let's look at what we do know about culture specifically. And I'll just say two things here that are already clear. The economic impact of closing arts venues is enormous. Here are some three quotes taken from written evidence that has just been submitted to the UK Parliamentary Committee on Culture, Media and Sport. The Association of British Orchestras saying the UK's orchestras are facing an existential crisis. London Theatre Consortium saying that in the second half of the financial year, that means from September to April next year, we very quickly fall off a cliff. And then I took this other example from one small, mostly rural part of the UK, where the local authority is saying that most businesses in the category of culture and tourism predict insolvency by June. And all of that has knock-on effects for the ecosystem of freelance artists, performers, musicians, designers, teachers, technicians, and of course, a suspension of all the community work that I have spent my life working in and which has become so strong and so important in the last 20 to 30 years. To give you one small example of how that works, musicians typically will earn their living from a mixture of concerts, teaching, and perhaps some things like playing at weddings and so on. All three of those things have suddenly become impossible to them. And these are people who live on relatively very low incomes and have no alternative way of earning their living. So that we already know is a huge economic impact. Then another thing we know is about the impact of this on audiences. And I want to share with you a bit of the findings from a report by a small audience research company called Indigo in the UK. They have had responses from 86,000 highly engaged respondents, which is interesting. This is the core audience for the arts. And of more than half of those 86,000 respondents say that they attend an artistic event more than 4 times a year. So here's some of what they say. 93% of them miss live events. So although the online world is undoubtedly important, as Pier Luigi Sacco has said, the live event remains really important to these audiences. But only 17% of them are booking, and those who are booking for November. 19% say they would come when venues reopen. So fewer than 1 in 5 people would automatically come back to a theatre or a gallery just because it's open. And 3/4 of them say they would feel safer with social distancing measures. Now we know, because the figures are already being done, we know that you can't run a theatre with social distancing methods, because it essentially means that you can have about 10% of your normal audience in. What that leads to is an economic model which is unsustainable. Now, all of that presents real problems that I think we are only beginning to get to grips with. And I think that the cultural sector is facing some very serious challenges and problems. I think, unfortunately, not all cultural organizations and cultural businesses will survive this period, but that isn't unique to culture. Not all florists, not all restaurants, not all small businesses will survive this period. At the same time, and this has been evoked already, culture matters profoundly, and culture will be part of how we will find our way through this crisis. And I want to suggest 4 ways in which I think that is true. The first is simply that it is a way of helping us make sense of our experience and of healing some of the wounds and the hurt that have been inflicted on our societies, and of finding a path towards recovery. That has already been an important part of how we have lived through this period. A lot of people have turned to poetry, to novels, and as well as other forms of digital entertainment, simply as a way to do this. But also, I'll give you an example. In Leeds, there's a theatre company called Slung Low. One of the projects they have done is in their neighborhood, they have invited people to make pictures and leave them on their doorsteps. They've then taken the pictures and they've taken photographs of the pictures, rather. They've left the original and printed them up and put them on lampposts. And as people are taking their daily exercise, they're seeing the images from the whole community on lampposts, and they're taking photographs of each other in front of their images. So that sense of using visual art as a way for a community to come together, to reflect on the experience that it's had, and to demonstrate in a public way, literally in the streets, its solidarity with each other, has been very profound. And so that process of bringing people together, which we currently can't do through concerts and live events and theatre, but we are learning to find other ways of doing, sometimes online, as we are doing now, but sometimes also in more socially distanced ways. And in the example that I just gave, culture is what makes us feel that we belong together, that we have relationships with each other, that we have shared experience that is meaningful and that we understand and can translate. All of that contributes to strengthening human capabilities, our ability to make choices. The previous contribution was talking about the power of culture. Culture is empowering in the sense that it gives us capacities. It enables us to do things that we could not do before, a whole range of things, which I won't go into now. But as a result of those capacities, we get more choices. We are able to do more things than we could before. And finally, it is the territory in which we can imagine and negotiate better ways of living with each other, better ways, that idea of that out of this, some people hope we can create a new world, we can renew our relationships with each other, we can change our value system, we can perhaps be less concerned with consumer culture and more concerned with the culture that we share and make together. That, I think, is where culture might give us a way to find a better way of living together with each other. So for me, culture matters for all of these reasons and for others. And it is crucial, but it is incredibly vulnerable now. How many artists and arts cultural organizations survive this period remains to be seen. I'm really very worried about where we are. And I think that, as with so many other of the crises that we're facing with, only government, both national and at the level of the European Union, is capable of helping us to work together in solidarity to meet what are ultimately collective rather than private crises. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation, and I'm waiting forward for the discussion to continue on some of the topics you've highlighted in your talk, like participation and doing culture together. What does it mean in these new current conditions? I would like to present next our second panel member, who is Elze Christensen-Redzepovich. She is expert and advisor in international cultural relations at Midena Creatives and project manager of Voices of Culture, structured dialogue between the European Commission and cultural stakeholders in Europe. Elze, please join our talk.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Kaunas, for inviting me to be participating in this extremely important discussion on the future, both present and post-COVID. And I'm really sorry that I can't see the audience. So I would like to just say hello to everybody and wishing to be able to catch up with you at some other stage in person. My presentation will take more the stand from the cultural sector point of view. So what is there that I think could be the future for the sector, and how can the sector take advantage of the situation that we're in? In the introduction, it was said that I'm manager of the EU project Culture, Voices of Culture, which is a structured dialogue between the European Commission and the cultural stakeholders in Europe. And what Voices of Culture does is actually take up important topics that are pointed out by cultural ministers of member states. And one of those topics to be discussed later on in the year is cultural rights. And the three strands under the topic cultural rights that are going to be fleshed out even more is fair remuneration for artists and people working in the cultural sector, artistic freedom, and artistic mobility. So this discussion is going to take place in October in Marseille. Maybe in Marseille, we don't know what the world is going to look like later on in the year. Maybe it will also be held in a digital platform like today. And what we could ask ourselves is, well, is it still relevant to be discussing cultural rights, or should we rethink and maybe put a higher emphasis on the situation that we're in? Actually, I think it's on the contrary, and that now is the time of all times to be discussing these topics, because they are really vital for the future. Before COVID-19, the topics were extremely important, and the Council of the European Union had decided to flag them, and they will be flagged even more now. And there are several reasons for this. Societies around the world, more than ever, need creative minds to rethink our common future. Creative minds can assist in finding good diagnoses to problems and challenges. Creative people have critical eyes on what is happening in society. They specialize in empathy and in building social cohesion, in creating participatory activities, in creating trust and understanding amongst people that encourages empowerment to doing something about it. And creative minds are prerequisites for innovation. And innovation is paramount for finding new and better solutions to the global reality that we are now facing. And COVID-19 is not going to be the last challenge that we will face. There will be many, many more challenges ahead of us. So we need creative minds around the tables in the parliaments and in the boardrooms, where the politics, the policy and instruments are being discussed. Secondly, unless the cultural sector rises and speaks into very, very big megaphones now, the chances are that the sector will be even more marginalized and regarded as non-essential. Europe is focusing now mainly on containment of the COVID-19 virus, consolidating health systems and preparing rescue packages, and reopening their countries. For now, the economic picture of the EU and the member states is not fully seen. In a few months, when the countries are up and running again and rescue packages are drying up, the naked picture of the number of unemployed people, the bankruptcies in the business world, and therefore also in the whole cultural sector, the big holes in the state budgets will become very clear. Europe will be in a state of severe economic crisis, and the world will be in a state of severe economic crisis. There will be political fights over priorities. And unless the cultural sector manages to consolidate and position itself, the cultural sector will lose out. Third, the sector must exercise assertiveness of self-worth It must learn the language of other sectors, the language of the industry, of agriculture, etc. They are sectors that are making themselves heard nationally, as well as in the EU. They are securing themselves political positions. They influence policy and they have their hands on the big financial packages. They are represented in parliaments and they speak with strong voices in the member states and in the EU. The cultural sector, being very fragmented and untrained as strategists in the world of politics and policy, are often still finding it necessary to argue about its own worth. The sector needs to learn to become more strategic, to become politicians. So, is the EU work plan for culture and the upcoming call to discuss cultural rights obsolete? I'll go into the three areas that I mentioned before, the interlinked areas that I think are also very interesting to look at in this connection. The first one is about fair remuneration for artists and people working in the arts and cultural sector. The special ecosystem of artists and cultural professionals consists of self-employed, small and micro enterprises with project-based careers. Such working conditions lend themselves to irregular and unpredictable incomes. There's no security for maternity/paternity leave, none or little pension or sick pay. The COVID-19 lockdowns have all but aggravated this already unsustainable situation for workers in this sector. The lockdown also sees many artists and cultural institutions producing impressive arts and cultural productions that is being streamed and distributed free of charge. The sector is amongst the worst hit sector, and the setbacks are significant, as we also just heard in the previous presentation. So has the time come to party with the business sectors in order to have a stronger voice? And has the time come for the cultural sector to learn from the very successful gaming industry on how to make money on streaming arts and culture? The second topic is artistic freedom. In this situation of crisis where priorities are being tested, it is paramount to underline the importance of artistic freedom. What was unthinkable a decade ago is now a reality, namely that artistic freedom is being contested in courts even. In some countries, artists risk criminal prosecutions and fines in Europe, even imprisonments if their work is perceived as unlawful. Artistic work is being evaluated in terms of non-artistic criteria. Politicians and ideological preferences are becoming the main criteria for what the world of arts is allowed and not allowed. And in the current COVID-19 political climate, countries are barricading themselves, everyone more or less fending for themselves. Emergency laws are introduced, and in some countries putting democracy on hold. European solidarity is sparse to non-existing, and the threat to artistic freedom as strong as ever. So we need to consider how we can remove impediments that stand in the way of artistic freedom. The last topic is artistic mobility. Mobility is regarded as essential for growing in our capacity as human beings and in broadening our horizons. Mobility of artists and cultural professionals is essential, both as a means of harvesting new inspiration, learning from others, networking, and of course delivering artistic and cultural products and performances. But at the same time, we also need to question if mobility is still responsible in response to global warming and threats to mobility. And we need to question how to deal with mobility in time of a pandemic. As we've witnessed with COVID-19, in an interconnected global society, the choices that are made in one part of the world can have severe effects in the other, far away. So how do we deal with the lack of cultural mobility in a world under lockdown and severe restrictions to mobility? How do we mitigate the risks for artists and cultural professionals in situations where mobility is being impaired? So the discussion on this has already started all over Europe, and I look forward to the Voices of Culture brainstorming meeting in October on this topic. And time will tell if the selected participants will come to Marseille or not, but we will meet somehow. So what can be concluded is that in order to improve cultural rights, as in fair pay, artistic freedom, and mobility, the sector must mobilize before it is being undermined by the big sectors in the fight for what is left post-COVID-19. Creative minds are essential around the decision tables in parliaments and boardrooms. The cultural sector needs to rise to make itself heard and to make it widely known that the sector is indispensable in developing new ways for societies to navigate post-COVID-19. It needs to set in place the very DNA of the sector, namely innovative thinking, to find ways to fend for its own position and influence in politics and policies. The sector must position itself in the plethora of committees that are being set up now in the different countries, committees that are planning the future. The independent cultural scene as well as cultural institutions need to learn to play the political game. They need to position themselves where decisions are made, not just trying to influence the decision makers. In doing so, cultural rights will be more in line with the rights as we know from all other sectors. And the result of that could be, hopefully, that the creative sector will rise and play a much, much bigger role in shaping the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was Elze Christensen-Redzepovich, an EU and European Capital of Culture expert and advisor. She's the manager of Voices of Culture, connecting the cultural sector of Europe and the European Commission. Dear participants of the European Capital of Culture Forum, we are continuing a session titled The Role of Culture Defeating the Crisis. And we have two more panel members and their contributions, their statements to listen to, which will be followed by a discussion conversation of us all. And next I would like to present our other panel member, whose name is Algirdas Ramashka. He is the CEO of Vilnius International Film Festival Kino Pavasaris. He organizes international industry event Meeting Point Vilnius. He established Kino Pavasaris distribution. He organizes outdoor screenings around Lithuania during summer months, experiential film screenings in unconventional venues. He consults other film festivals and culture institutions on organizational matters, gives lectures at international seminars, is a member of the boards of experts at major cultural organizations, and during the quarantine, since the very beginning, was very much at the avant-garde of the culture scene, adjusting to the current conditions of the functioning of the culture sector. Algirdas, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I will start for this that I hope that to put something new into this discussion and to be more practical details and to share our experience, what we had, what kind of edition of the festival we had this year, and how we faced the front line of pandemic. And it's important, I guess, I believe that it's very important in these days and in this situation to be active in our sector and to act proactive, and rather than to be passive and wait for decisions from above, and to take care of things and to take things into your own hands. And the role of the culture defeating the crisis is the creativity and the braveness. And there's always some windows always are open when all doors are shut down. So I will share my presentation about our things, how we see that, and how we had the festival this year, which I was very happy to share in the beginning with more than 400 festivals straight after we finished it. And this is our experience from the front line facing the coronavirus pandemic and trying to keep the promise to our audience to make the festival no matter what. And for more than a year, we were preparing to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the festival. And we planned a lot of new experiences and gifts for our beloved audience, like exceptional screenings in National Opera Theatre, from classic Charles Chaplin film Circus with live orchestra to midnight screenings, etc. And everything is suddenly changed very dramatically and very fast. When countries start to close down, we knew that we were not going to have international guests, and it was heartbreaking, but we had to cancel our industry event, Meeting Point Vilnius, because we didn't have the resources to make it online. But we still believe that we can make the festival happen for our local audience, even without the guests from like international guests. But on the morning of 12th of March, I received a call from Vilnius City Mayor, who told me that he's very sorry, but there is no way that the festival can happen this year. But at that point, I remember I said to Mr. Mayor, I said, "No, Mr. Mayor, you are not right. The festival will happen because we gave the promise to the audience, and we are ready to go with the plan B, and we have the plan B to move the festival to online edition." And I said that it's very important, I guess, and for all our organization, because we were in this position where we gonna, to be or not to be, because the whole festival plan was already done, and canceling the event, it would we would end up, I think, maybe in the bankrupt, because the festival budget of 1.5 million euros, and which is already all the job was done, not to be happening, is what would be the suicide for us. So, and I said to the mayor also that during the quarantine, because we had our colleague from Italy, and we had a lot of news what's happening and how the people feel while they're at home, that they not only the medical health that we need to take care, but also about we need to talk and think about the emotional and mental health of the people when they will be stuck at home for a very long period. And we agreed on that, and we got a very big support, not like a financial, but at least it was very big political and moral support, which we were very thankful for that. So our team, we are together with the team, we accepted the challenge without understanding what can come out of that, but with the courage and strong belief what we do. And we had only 7 days to prepare a new online edition, and we wanted to save as much team involvement as possible, because with the changed circumstances, some departments wasn't needed anymore, and we didn't need like guest department, location, event department, volunteers department, but we wanted to keep the team together, and we reshaped the jobs that need to be done, and we managed to keep the 85% of the team working, which in numbers it would be more than 100 people still were involved and working for this edition. And for us it was crucial to keep our team busy and to keep team doing what they were planning to do. And we made decision to work with all local streaming platforms to support also the platforms. And we were working with 5 in total. And we managed to keep 69% of the program, thanks to the filmmakers who also got into this experiment with us, because we were the first festival, I guess, in the world to go to move it online. And we didn't know what to expect from the filmmakers, but they were very supportive. And only 30% of the program we couldn't screen because of the right holders. They didn't want to let us screen it online. And we were very proud that we managed to keep the competition programs, even like with the jury working online. And in the end, we gave the prizes. And there is, you can see the results. Just comparing with the last year, we had an audience of 126,000. So this year we sold 56,000 admissions, and the survey that was done by our partners showed that average two people were watching the film at home per screening. So that means about 120,000 in total audience that watched the films during the festival times. And we managed to save 41% from planned ticket revenue, which was painful for us. We managed to save 50% from sponsorship sponsorship funding, because a lot of position that was agreed with the sponsors could not be realized, like activation zones with this, in the cinemas, advertising before screenings, etc. And luckily, which I'm really proud that it really worked, that the public funding that we say this was 94%. So it the promise from the government or for public institutions not to change anything was kept. So we were very thankful for that. And it was talking about reaching the audiences, and in the media, it was extremely hard to break the wall of Corona news and media everywhere, because it's the only news was happening. It was about the same thing. But we managed to put ourselves as a good news, and not to mention viruses or pandemia, not even in a single word. And we were the only good news at this time. We had a big support not only from our all media partners, but from media in general. And you can see the results, but and it's comparing with the last year. I think it's like double results, twice bigger than we used to have it on the previous years. And I was very happy that we found the ways, a lot of creative ways, to involve the audience into our festival. And we made the festival opening ceremony that the people were celebrating well dressed at home, and watching the opening ceremony and watching the opening film. So during the closing ceremony, when we were broadcasting from live from closed cinema, which supposed to be happening, the closing gala event, and we gave the awards there, and then we screened the closing festival film of Matthias and Maxim by Dolan at empty cinemas across the Lithuania, also to show a support and to pay some tribute to the cinemas which are closed and they don't have any businesses going. So I think it was a lot of nice and creative things that you can do about it. And the biggest surprise, even we were on the front line and our audience was in shock, because it was the first weeks of quarantine. We were expecting that we can beat even the bigger numbers, and we expected that we can have even more audience that we had on a regular basis. But we found out that that the audience would basically, they would have a lot of free time and they will watch the film, but in reality everyone was super busy trying to adopt the new way of life, working from home and taking care of the kids at the same time, which I think the real heroes is not only the medical workers, but those who had to work at home and taking care of the kids at the same time. And even we had some problems with the internet connection, because in the first weeks it was during the extreme demand, wasn't even the Lithuanian, where I think maybe we have the fastest internet in the world. It was not that stable in the beginning. And one more thing, after we successfully did the festival, there was another, I think, unique project that we successfully did, and it's still a few weeks left that it's still happening. So it's our project Kaunas, where we did a drive-in cinema in closed airport, in Vilnius airport. And I'm extremely happy about this project, where we adapted to the challenges and to all this safe regulations, but the people could enjoy the film experience, cinema experience on the big screen. The screen size is like a 5-story building, and the people are watching basically European films, art house films, and in a very romantic and very unique atmosphere in the airport next to the planes. And this project was very much shown and reported in the mass media across the world. And this, I know, it reached like 500 million people across the world, and was shown on, I don't know, the news appeared in New York Times, BBC. I was talking on BBC Radio and all the biggest media channels, and we had the chance to even step up and to show that even in these crazy times, creativity and brave decisions matters, and you can still do something nice. And for the end, I would say that the crisis was the biggest challenge for culture sector, to use their creativity and to adopt the changed world. But I think at the same time we need to be united and to fight and prove to the government and the people in power about the role and importance of the cultural economy, about the whole our sector, because it's still, as the previous speakers were telling, that not everyone, especially in the government power people, it's clear what it is, the soft power thing as a culture. So and I think it's very important to share good practices. So I'm really proud that after a few days after finishing the festival, we organized a webinar where we're attending 500 festivals, more than 400 festivals from across the world, and we still keeping in touch with many of them and trying to share our experience with them to inspire and to help them do it the same or to do it better. So yeah, so this is more or less all from me.
Thank you very much, Algirdai. This was Algirdas Ramaška. He's the CEO of International Vilnius Film Festival Kino Pavasaris. Dear participants, I'm now going to present our last member of the panel, Pete Kercher. Pete graduated in law. He's a founder member of EIDD, Design for All Europe. He has served as EIDD's roving ambassador since 2007. A convinced believer in applying design methods to the strategic challenges generated by today's complex and continuously changing societies, so as to trigger interdisciplinary cross-fertilization and synergy. He writes articles and manifestos for political, legal, and design publication. He provides strategic design consultancy to many international projects, teaches in several schools and universities in Europe, and holds workshops in the application of design for all and strategic design methods to issues of audience development in the fields of culture, culture heritage, and inclusion. Pete, over to you. What do you make of the statements that you've just heard from the other panel members?
Well, thank you, Anna. Thank you for the invitation to come to Kaunas virtually to speak. First of all, I want to say that it's been a very interesting experience listening to all these different presentations, some very different points of view, some very different takes. And I'm sure I share this with the other participants as well, an intense sensation of frustration that we cannot do some brainstorming together when the session closes, which is what we would normally do in a meeting like the European Capital of Culture Forum. I'm fascinated by the wonderful proposal from Else to talk more strategy, to talk more politics, because this is obviously my own language as an organizer. I'm fascinated by the background that we just heard, and yes, I did see about the airport being doubled as a cinema, as a live cinema, a drive-in cinema, not because I was particularly following a cultural agenda, but I saw it on social media, and it really did get extremely good publicity all over the world. By the way, for those who don't know, I'm speaking from Italy, so we are the country that is worst hit. And I'm speaking from Lombardy, which is the region which is worst hit. I have been in lockdown since I came back from my last foreign trip on the 23rd of February. So that's nearly 3 months now. And we are just beginning to loosen up. So I'm going to work in my reactions to some other points that I wanted to raise. First of all, the very first thing I want to do is to suggest the need every now and then to step back and look at the bigger picture and to see where we are in, put this into context. We are in a situation of fear, widespread fear. Some of this is justified and some of this is media induced for good or less good reasons. It's not my point to discuss the value of those reasons now, but it's a fact of life that the population is living in fear. As a result, we reacted by instinctive closure. In this region, in my region of Lombardy, quite possibly overdoing it. We probably went more than we needed to, but in this particular circumstance, it was not such a bad thing to do. I'm very aware of the issues of restricted personal freedom that we heard discussed. And I trust that here we are going to see the end of these restrictions. It has been very interesting to see how people have reacted to this, because this is also a cultural issue. You know, when we talk about how we react to situations, this also has a great deal to do with our cultural imprinting and the way that we work. So I'm giving a very broad interpretation to the term culture and taking a note also from what we heard before, that we are by no means restricting this discussion only to the world of the arts, or performing arts, but we really should take a very, very broad look at this. As a reaction to the instinctive closure that we had at the beginning, we are just beginning to experience the inebriation of the reopening. This is something that is potentially dangerous, but it is perfectly understandable. Our population has been imprisoned in isolation for 10 weeks, nearly 3 months. It's understandable that when the message comes out that there is an end in sight, we will open our borders on the 3rd of June with no quarantine restrictions for people coming in from other member states of the European Union or the rest of the Schengen area. then the message that is conveyed is, okay, the emergency is over. And of course, there will be some exaggerated reactions, and we've already seen some of these. Now, where does culture fit into this situation? Well, I try to think in a different way about this. I try to take a devil's advocate view to this. And I want to suggest that culture is essentially a chameleon. Different people see culture, and they see different things in culture. They see it in different ways. It's a chameleon because it is constantly changing probably faster than we realize. As the world changes, our culture is what is actually changing. Yes, the virus is an external factor that is impacted on us, but our reactions have been diversified, and the changes that we are bringing about to the ways that we behave are essentially cultural as well. So I want to suggest that our culture is in our DNA. And in that way, it is diversified because our DNA is diversified. We relate to our cultures in general without perceiving that we do so. Again, please bear with me. I'm not talking about the recognized arts. I'm talking about what makes us the human beings that we are. Because this is how I define culture, what makes us the human beings that we are. We relate to this without perceiving it. But how does it relate to us? How does the formality of culture relate to us? There is a risk that it is perceived outside of discussions like this, which are really quite advanced and open and projected towards the future. Outside, among those political decision makers that Elsa was talking about before, the risk is that the perception is one of sealed containers. The museums, the theatres, the art galleries. This is not going to be the way forward. I'm afraid there is a risk here of there being a self-fulfilling prophecy. We are allowing ourselves to be painted into the corner of recognized boxes, the boxes that are easy for decision makers to deal with, relatively easy, rather than the complexity of the overall situation, the holistic situation of what culture really is. When we are facing the emergency, we as a community have to be really consolidated and aware of the need to resist the temptation to focus on problem solving. We must resist the temptation to focus on the short-term economic question of balancing the books. It is a vital issue. People are losing their jobs, myself included. I haven't done anything really to earn money for the last 3 months because I'm one of those categories, like many others, that all the different building blocks that make up what I do have simply stopped functioning. And yet I'm insisting that we must resist the temptation to focus only on this, but put it into the bigger picture of the challenge of how the chameleons will be relating to the constant change. The situation of the coronavirus is part of that constant change. It's an unexpected meteor that's come in from one side and knocked us out of our normal orbit. But that normal orbit was maybe not functioning perfectly well to the benefit of the cultural community in any case. We were not a major planet orbiting around our solar system, but we were perceived as a series of maybe comets that occasionally appear with an irregular orbit, or a meteorite shower. Well, now we've had a big meteorite that's come in and it's hit us and it's knocked us out of the normal comfort zone. Maybe we can turn the disadvantage around and try to see whether, as Rytis said at the very beginning, we can't ally with this challenge and turn the disadvantage into an advantage. Try to look at the potential silver lining to every cloud. Obviously, as I come from the background of design for all as well, it's necessary that I should say a couple of words about accessibility. And Pier Luigi already touched on this issue in his recorded speech earlier on. I think the interesting issue is that for many years, there has been a growing tendency to translate the issue of accessibility to our cultural heritage into terms of digitalization of cultural content, of heritage content, for people who have difficulty in approaching or accessing the venues of cultural heritage. It has been presumed that that is a satisfactory solution. Now, it seems to me that, in fact, a lot of people are discovering that maybe it's not quite as satisfactory as we would like. And that is because it now affects us. It affects the able-bodied, those of us who are accustomed to being able to go to museums, accustomed to being able to go to the theatre, to the cinema. And we discover that actually it is an alienating process to be obliged to experience only at several removes through the media of digitalization. Now, of course, we can use digitalization to our benefit. But I think that, again, to see a silver lining, the fact that we have all had to have our noses rubbed in the reality of digitalization means that we may have a greater awareness, and I trust we shall have a greater awareness of what it means to be excluded from the physical reality. And so we will have a more coherent and more consequential approach to digitalization and to the making possible the alternatives to physical access, because now it touches everybody. So, yes, it was a very interesting issue that, that Pier Luigi raised, also a proposal for a digital platform, a public platform. I suspect that this could be, if we do our lobbying intelligently, this could be a major issue to be discussed in the European Parliament in the near future and among the decision makers in the European Commission. You know, culture has, in fact, on the sly, been becoming digital for decades. Internet, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, all these media have made an enormous difference in our cultural interactions in recent years. So maybe we are getting to the point, in Italian we say, il nodo viene al pettine. It means the knot comes to the comb. It's not my case now with the very short hair I have, self-grooming. But when you're combing your hair, you have a knot in your hair, the comb stops, and that's when you have to face the issue. Maybe this is the point in time when we face the issue of what it means that our culture has gradually been digitalizing in any case. It is not actually an alien otherness. It is part of what we do and how we are. But let's, again, avoid an easy temptation. In the very early days of internet, companies, organizations, associations had a habit of making their web page by simply taking their normal printed format and putting it onto the web. It didn't take very long to understand that this was not the best way to make use of a different kind of medium. The same sort of thing must go through our minds now when we are transposing cultural content and transposing access to culture into digital formats. We must not think that we can just beam the same material through a different medium. Different media require different thinking. Now, maybe I'm stating the obvious, but sometimes the obvious benefits from being stated. Now I'll move on to the aging population. Again, another point that was raised earlier, and very important point. And here I'm going to quote from a presentation that I made myself in Korea in October last year, because the issue of accessibility and of design for all, in fact, I want to encapsulate the message that was coming across beforehand and take the, I want to take the reasoning right through to its conclusion. Accessibility and design for all in society and in culture enabled participation. Participation, in its turn, enables socialization. Socialization generates endorphin neurotransmitters, and these are the positive neurotransmitters that stave off depression and make the psychosomatic conditions and physical pathologies that come from aging, for example, much slower to develop. When we have a slower or delayed development in psychosomatic and physical pathologies, our healthcare costs go down. When we are living in a society that we know is aging, and this is common all over the developed world, and increasingly also as other countries catch up with development, it's becoming common everywhere. Our society is aging, our healthcare costs are going up. We have to find alternative ways rather than just putting people into hospitals or to care homes, and we've seen what that can lead to. It is vital to increase access, the level of access of the aging population in particular, to culture in all its ramifications, because that is the way to keep the costs of healthcare down. We've learned now that healthcare cannot be cut. The cost of healthcare cannot be cut. It has proved to be an enormous risk when we didn't have the intensive care units that we needed. We didn't have them because we were trying to do everything by cope with everything through healthcare. My thesis is that we can also achieve healthcare by investing in cultural accessibility. And one investment in cultural accessibility can have an avalanche result that decreases the necessary investment in healthcare, in palliative healthcare for the elderly by 100. Now, just to close my points now, I want to throw a rock into the pond. And the rock I want to throw into the pond when we talk about culture, let's not please keep on insisting on defining what culture is. Let's try to challenge our decision makers by saying, imagine you take culture away. Then please tell me what is left. What is left if you take culture away? And I suggest what is left is very little indeed. Because if you take culture away, there will be no humanity. There will only be automatons, only machines. And my closing point now will be in relation to one of the bags I have hanging up behind me, this one. I was privileged to moderate the opening session of the European Commission's conference in Katowice in January about the European Green Deal and the Just Transition Programme. Let's remember all of these things have to be taken together. We should not be looking at these things as watertight containers. Culture has a vital role to play in preparing for and facing climate change. The European Green Deal is a cultural issue. Changing the way that we live in our society is a cultural issue. It's not just about cleaner industry. The way we change our industry is a cultural issue. The transition away from heavily polluting heavy industry of the traditional kind and towards innovative, new creative industries is a cultural issue. These are the challenges that I see being faced, in addition to all the other extremely important ones that the other speakers have spoken about before. And I think that the future is may I say it's exciting. So thank you very much, and I look forward to receiving some questions.
Thank you very much, Pete, for the positive note. And I would like to remind our audience you are participating in a discussion in a session of European Capital of Culture Forum titled The Role of Culture Defeating the Crisis. We're going to stay online for approximately another half hour due to a delay in the start of our session. Our session was prolonged, and you still have an opportunity to post your questions to the members of the panel. And I would like to present each of them once again. We are here with François Matarasso. He's community artist, writer, and researcher. And please, could you connect back your cameras and microphones for the discussion? We are also here with Rytis Zemkauskas, a journalist and television producer, a curator at Kaunas 2022. Algirdas Ramaška, the CEO of Vilnius International Film Festival Kino Pavasaris, and Pete Kekher, who is the ambassador of the EIDD Design for All Europe and consultant in strategic design. Dear audience, you also listened to some statements from Pier Luigi Sacco and Elze Christensen-Redzepovic. Due to time restrictions, these two panel members couldn't continue participating in the discussion, but you can post your questions online, and your questions will be reviewed and passed over to these two panel members. Pier Luigi Sacco will also participate in a discussion of the European Capital of Culture on Friday, and he will be able to respond to these questions during during this discussion. And Elze Christensen-Redzepovic promised to come back to our online platforms in response to your comments and questions in text. So, dear panel members, I would like to start with a few questions from myself. And firstly, I would like to ask François, since you work in participative art field, I would like to speak to you, or for you to comment more on this participatory art in this challenging time. You know, the social dimension of culture becomes ever more important, but the conditions for participatory arts are very challenging in many ways. Now it's even harder to reach the society who are hard to reach enough. There is, in fact, a risk to reinforce inequalities. And the current conditions for arts practices, they, I think, object the participatory or community arts. So does this crisis make artists and the society closer or further apart in your view? And how should the participatory art function in these circumstances?
You ask a really difficult question, because participatory art, community art is essentially about bringing people together, which is the one thing we're not able to do. There has been a lot of work happening. People have turned to their own creativity naturally, in the example that I gave, because they have time on their hands, they have an experience that they are trying to get to grips with and to understand and to share and to externalize and to make sense of. So actually a huge amount of cultural activity is happening in people's homes. Everything from drawing and reading to knitting and painting and photography and who knows what. I know one of my neighbors lent their neighbor, who's an elderly woman, an electronic keyboard, and she used to play the piano and has now started playing Bach again. So all kinds of things are happening. The difficulty that we have as people who work in that field professionally is how do we make our work? I wrote recently about I was supposed to do a creative writing workshop in April and May. What happens if I'm asked to do it in November? How do I assess the risk of working with bringing elderly people together to take part in a creative writing workshop, given that I can't know what that risk is to them in terms of their health? So I think the first, I don't have answers. I suppose two things. One is to acknowledge the importance, the desire that there is for people to connect and to make things happen offline. And in France, where I am, there are 500 white zones where there is no internet access. So there are hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of children who are supposed to be being homeschooled, who can't speak to their teachers, except perhaps with a bad signal on a mobile phone. We have to recognize the enormous desire of people and need of people to make art together in their own homes, but also together. And then we also have to accept and find some kind of solutions to the very real practical problems that will exist for a while social distancing continues.
Thank you very much, François. Rita, we're touching the topic of not only forms of culture, of cultural content, but also about the language of culture or politics of culture. I've mentioned this aspect in my interview with Pier Luigi Sacco. And what are your thoughts? Do you think this current situation provokes new politics in culture or new priorities?
I think it's inevitable. It must.
Oh, I'm sorry, Pete. I'm sorry, Pete. This question now goes to Rytis. And
sorry, I understood it was for me. Sorry.
I would welcome any comments from other panel members after.
I misunderstood.
Pete, Pete, go ahead. If you have something to say, I think. New politics of culture. It is. There are two sides to that. It is local and it is international sides. Okay, so locally. I don't think we have big changes up to now because it takes time. We are still very, very early in this process. We don't know where we are now, basically, to be very, very strict about it. We don't know. We don't know what the consequences will be. We don't know what's going to be in autumn, as my colleague François has said. We don't know. So there are lots of uncertainties. And in politics, when they have lots of uncertainties, they switch to promises. And this is when problems happen, because they want to be, they want to be popular, they want to be loved. So they switch to promises. They heavily rely on promises. And in many cases, they make situation worse. So to my mind, today, it would be wise to hold back as much as possible, of course, because there are issues we cannot hold back on, of course, there are pressing issues. But in many cases, just hold back and rethink the situation, and consult. Because we are in a situation, it's very difficult. When you are in a moment, it's very difficult to see the big picture. Nobody can see, except Martians. Nobody can see the big picture here because it is global as never before. And politics, well, generally politics, international relations connected with culture pose many problems because again, international is always political. Always, and when something is political, it slows down. Then you can fall into a victim of lots of compromises. And acting is local, so we should give us some time ourselves, as much as possible. This is my position.
Thank you. Pete, you wanted to add a comment?
Yes, just one thing. There is a window of necessity where, unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of waiting for too long, and that is the budget discussion in the European Parliament for the next framework period. Here, I think I must add my voice to Else before, who made a very strong statement about the necessity to encourage increases, a very strong increase in the investments made at the European level in culture, in the area of culture in general. But having said that, I think we do need, in fact, to walk a tightrope. We do need to establish the principle that that budget must be increased, but at the same time, I think there's a very real risk that we would be rushing in, fools rushing in where angels fear to tread, because the times are not ripe to establish how that money should be spent. So yes, part of it does need to be the here and now in facing the crisis, the very real economic crisis of people working in the cultural sector and who have no prospects here and now. François depicted it extremely well beforehand in his presentation, giving us some real figures, and I think the same is reflected all over Europe and in many other parts of the world as well. But at the same time, we also need to know that there has to be more than just something to make up for lost earnings. We need to have some medium to long-term strategic planning, and thankfully, the European Parliament has a longer period than national parliaments. It usually has a 7-year funding period nowadays, whereas most national parliaments are subject to the next general election, the next regional election, and they're always electioneering. So it's very, very difficult to pin down the politicians at national level. And we do have something of an advantage at European level, where we can talk to the Parliament of the European Commission, and times can be more strategic. So we need to balance this.
Thank you, Pete. I would like to involve also the audience and make the voices of the participants heard. And we have viewers in Xiamen City in China, which is the sister city of Kaunas. And there are a few questions, one of which probably touches most of the statements we've heard from all panel members. The question is, in what way can culture be used to create new development opportunities while giving full play to its role in tiding over the crisis? Is there any panel member who would like to comment on this question?
I think, Anna, actually I answered part of that, the first part of that question already, with that short presentation of how culture can relate to healthcare. I think we need to look into that. This is an area of major importance to the cultural sector. There is an enormous amount of work to be done, and the way to persuade decision makers of the validity is to show them how much we can save in healthcare. And if there is anything that is right at the top of the list of priorities now, it's how to have a more effective healthcare system, how to make sure that our spending is more effective. We cannot afford to spend enormous amounts more, especially now after in the economic crisis, the depression that we shall have. But we should be spending very intelligently in our healthcare. So we need to cut out what shouldn't be there. And what should not be there is not the intensive care. But what should not be there is what could be replaced by keeping people happier and more socially active and participatory. And that is the job of culture, not healthcare, or at least more majorly of culture and not solely of healthcare as it has been today. We've always put things into watertight containers. That has been the way that our society has grown and specialized, and it is time to stop. It is time to stop this very, very bad practice. We have to learn to speak to each other and to give each other credence for the way that we can impact positively between different areas of specialization, without wanting to detract in any way from the importance of medical care and healthcare. But in fact, I was privileged to speak last year in a conference at Milan Polytechnic about healthcare, design in healthcare, and it is noticeable that increasing research is being invested precisely in this respect now, how there are other ways of taking care of health, especially with an aging population, and not only through the old style medical model. We had this discussion about disability 20, 30 years ago, when we moved away from the medical model and towards the social model. It's time to do the same thing with aging and with the cultural impact the positive impact that culture can have on healthcare for the aging.
Thank you. François, do you have any comments on this topic?
I think the starting point for me is recognizing the first slide that I showed, the scale of the change that's happening. That requires a massive response from all of us, and including from our governments. And I think that there is a precedent in the sense of in the example of what Roosevelt did in the 1930s in America. I think that we are going to have governments with real imagination. So to take one example, this summer there will be about 750,000 children due to leave school in the UK, 16-year-olds. What's going to happen to them? Where are they going to go? Are they going to get into college? Where are the jobs for them? We need to think about what kind of programs can we put in place that can do that. Now, there has been, I've read calls for the equivalent of what Roosevelt did with the Works Progress Administration in 1930s America, which was to employ artists to photograph and paint and make a lot of work, and that was an important program, but it was of its time. I think if we just employ artists to go and make stuff, we will be failing the needs of our society. But if we can employ artists to start responding to what communities are wanting to do. So if, for instance, if you can't open your theatre or your gallery, maybe what you can do is build a relationship with your local secondary school, which already doesn't have enough space for all of its pupils in social distancing. Open your space, help them discover other things alongside the educational way. Make those relationships, but artists and cultural activists can come up with the ideas, but in the end, it is going to require governments to have the vision to say, we have such a crisis, so many people in need, that we need to put in place the programs of a real scale that can begin to work and heal our way out of the place where we've got ourselves to.
Thank you. Are there any other comments on this question? If not, I'd like to get back to Algirdas for a moment. And we've been speaking in a few moments about behavioral changes. Everyone is now talking about and is concerned about the audience, whether we will see it back in our theaters, in our physical institutions and events. Well, François also mentioned some survey data, surveys of audiences that shows that there is a decrease in will to participate, or there is lack of trust in the safety of our events and participation in cultural activities. It's hard to predict now, as we've all noted. It's hard to predict what we will be going through in a few months or even half year. Still, experiencing the recent new models of culture, new models of communication with your audience, what might be behavioral changes in your view, Algirdai, how it might impact culture in the near or more further future?
I think that what was in François' numbers, that 93% of the people, they are missing live events, and I think it's 100% of people that missing social events just to be together. And we can see it from the people who arrives into this airport cinema, drive-in cinema. They want to feel to be together, and we have different events. We're not just screening the films. We are, for example, having a DJ playing before the midnight screening, and the people are almost dancing in their cars, and they're having fun, and they are feeling like unity together, being in some kind of participation in some event together. So I think people are missing it so much. It's the same as we also became very famous thanks to Vilnius city decision to open all public spaces for coffee bars and to open open air like coffee tables like on bars. So now the city is full of people, and they miss this. They want to get out. They want to be in social environment together with other people. So I believe we need to be creative, and we need to adapt to the things that what happens. But it's also the possibilities, and I always see as a possibilities to find new ways of doing it. And even for us moving online, we found a totally new audience, totally new audiences. And whatever we do, a different move, a different angle of what we used to do, we develop our audience, and we found the new audiences. So I think it's a good time now, and it's a good time to experiment, and all the events, and we have now drive-in concert happening, etc. But and it's soon in Lithuania is opening for open air events for up to 1,000 spectators. I believe that it's going to be back. It's people are missing it. If the people will have money for that, this is then another question. If they will have money for these events to pay for the tickets.
Thank you. This question about the future formats of events and culture is really important also in the framework of the program implemented by our office, the European Capital of Culture program, and which has a very strong international dimension that suffered hugely from this from these current events. You know, right now we are delivering an event that usually attracts 500-700 people over a few days, mostly representing Lithuanian and European sector. But in fact, today we have also viewers in China and probably a wider, more international audience than usually. So on the one hand, this new digital formats or new focus on digital allows us a bigger access to the global audience and brings us closer together, you might think. But on the other hand, you know, it really stops some international programs. As you might have heard, Galway 2020 and Rijeka 2020 Capitals of Culture were stopped for, well, a period that is not yet known. Also, there is an initiative of postponing the European Capital of Culture programs of 2021 into the year of 22. Do you all see possibility of implementation of international programs such as European Capital of Culture? And in fact, what is the role of international programs such as Capital of Culture in this new world where physical borders and national interests are rising?
Shall I go?
This is a question to all, so please.
Okay. I think at the moment we're talking as though the world has changed radically and will never go back to what it was. And I dare say that in 1920, Many people felt the same thing after the Spanish flu epidemic. I think in 1355, if there had been the possibility to discuss internationally, the world's population would have had very, very strong reason to question whether the world was coming to an end after the Black Death had taken about 1/3 of the population of the known world, from China right through to the Atlantic Ocean. And yet, you know, life goes on. We do overcome these things. A historian would look at the Black Death and say it was the catalyst that created the possibility for collective bargaining, maybe to increase the wages of farm laborers. It put an end in many societies to the feudal system. So it was a catalyst for change, although it came at an intolerably high cost. Now, in this case, thanks to the way that communications, international communications and government controls have functioned, the cost has been, although absolute for those who have felt it directly, the cost has been nothing comparable to the cost of the Black Death or the Great Plagues of the 17th and early 18th centuries. So if we put this into perspective, we have a catalyst for change that is taking place. But we will, as a society, as multiple and diverse societies, we will go back to socializing in due course. It may take a little while, and it's probably not a bad thing if it takes a little while, because a due amount of caution is correct. But we will go back, and there will be large meetings again. The loss that we have from not being able to hold the European Capital of Culture Forum in a physical way is, as we all know, those of us who attend conferences, the interesting discussions that take place between the meetings, in the corridors, where a lot of the brainstorming happens, a lot of the new ideas are born because people from different backgrounds come together in a totally informal environment, which is unstructured. And it is important that it be unstructured. And as much as we want to, a digital platform has to have some form of structure and cannot allow us to be as unstructured as that spontaneity requires. We will go back there. It will take a little bit longer. Is there a role for the European Capital of Culture? You bet there is. Of course there is. It's a major, major, major project. It is, let's not forget what it's about to begin with, you know, about culture being a driver for redevelopment of cities, redevelopment of areas, for opening up new opportunities to innovation. This is what it's about. This is just one more culture, one more challenge. It's a major one, but it's not going to stop us, because that's not what we're about. You know, in the cultural sector, we are not about stopping. We are about looking at everything to seek for the opportunities. That's what we do.
Thank you. Thank you. What about other panel members? Do you see in the situation a risk for international cooperation, international dialogue, and what's the role of the cultural programs in this sense?
I was remembering my grandmother, when she got married, she left the south of France, where she grew up, and moved to Thessaloniki in Greece. That was in 1920, thereabouts. And as far as I know, she went back to France once in the 1920s and 1930s. We now, that's unthinkable now. We are so connected. We're scattered all over the world, but we can pick up the phone and we can talk to each other, and we can do what we're doing now from our different locations. So I think that openness to others, that willingness to listen, to learn from other cultures and other countries, I think that is now part of our culture, if you like. It's part of how we do things. And that will continue. It'll continue in a different way for a while. But provided we don't allow those who think that the solution is to take back control to close our minds for us, then our minds can stay open and alive, and our hearts too. And this will do fine until we can travel again. And to be honest, I think we might learn that there are compensations in not running around Europe at the drop of a hat just to have a conversation, interesting as they are.
Thank you. Dear members of the panel, we have 4 minutes left till the end of the broadcast, and we have a few moments in case someone has a final statement, final comment to make.
I have one thing I want to tell you, Anna. I found a bookmark, and it has to do with the support that culture has given to us in the lockdown and in these trying times. It's a quotation from Montesquieu, who said, "I have never found any distress that an hour's reading did not relieve." And I think that's something we can take with us.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all panel members, all participants of this initial session of the European Capital of Culture virtual forum. And I'd like to invite you to follow the rest of the program of the forum, which continues tomorrow and the day after. And tomorrow we have 2 more sessions, one at 10 a.m. Eastern European time, which is called Culture in the Measures of Management of the Economic Crisis. And this session is particularly important for the Lithuanian audience and will be broadcasted in Lithuanian language, but at 3 p.m. Eastern European time, that means 2 p.m. Central European time, there will be a session called Local or International, Shifting Priorities in Public Funding for Culture. This session is particularly important for the whole cultural creative sector, as it will inform about the current programs that are there to support the actors of the cultural sector. Thank you very much. Thank you to all participants, to our audience. Let's continue our conversations in the next sessions.
Thank you.
The real value of culture becomes evident in the face of crisis. Culture in the time of Corona. Virtual European Capital of Culture Forum on May 20 to 22.